May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable unto thee, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. So Abram is not a perfect man, but God has chosen him and blessed him. He has a very large household. He can muster hundreds of men when he goes into battle, but he has no heir. Eleazar of Damascus, a slave born in his household, will inherit everything when he dies. Now this bears a little explanation. When we think of slavery, we tend to think of the horrific form practiced in this country in the last several centuries. But the slavery in the Bible is not entirely like that. Slaves, in this sense, are not things that one can own in the same way one owns a house or a car or even a goat. Slaves are people and are recognized as people, but their social status is more like that of children. They are entirely dependent on their master, just as children are entirely dependent on their fathers. But the children grow up to take on the responsibility and status of their parents, whereas the slaves remain in a state of dependency. Slaves can come to exercise responsibility in a household. They can own things themselves. They can even buy back their freedom. But until they do, they owe service to the master. And the master is then responsible for their food and care. Eleazar is evidently a beloved and responsible member of Abram's household. But he is not a son and an heir. He's not raised to take the reins. He is a dependent. But even though God has promised that Abram's descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the ground, there is not one child yet. And so Abram proposes to adopt the slave in order to keep the household together and provide leadership at his death. But God says, no, don't do that. You will have a son to receive the inheritance. And Abraham trusted God. He believed him. Abram wasn't a two-dimensional stained glass figure of piety. If you've read Genesis, you know this. He was at times fearful, even deceptive. He did not always keep the right thing in the forefront of his mind. But here is the one thing that he does consistently. When the chips are down, Abram always believes and trusts God. Abram trusts God enough to leave everything he knows and go wherever God tells him to go. Abram trusts God enough to live as a stranger and an exile among the people of Canaan and Egypt. And he will continue to get himself in trouble, but whenever God speaks, Abram trusts him enough to believe what he's told and act on it. And the book of Genesis says that God reckoned it to him as righteousness. Our translation of Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." That's a great translation. It's really, it's wonderful English. But it's not quite what the Greek says. What it really says is this: now faith is the essence of things hoped for, the proof of things not seen. It's not just that faith is belief in what you can't see. That's the easy part. Right? We do that every day. There are things we can't see, but we believe in them. And it's simply not true that faith is a blind leap into believing something for which there is no evidence. That's not faith at all. That's just silliness. There is plenty of evidence in creation and in our own nature and experience that God is there. The hard part is to exercise your will, to act on the evidence, even though you can't actually touch or see the reality. What the author of Hebrews is saying is that kind of trust in God actually does something. It somehow brings those invisible things that are hoped for into present reality. Not because the world around you has passed away or become less, but because you now live for that other world. You live for your true home. It must be that way, the apostolic author says, because it was by faith that the men of old received divine approval. Their faith actually accomplished in them what God intended. It changed them. It changed their allegiances. It changed their purposes. God was pleased with them rather than ashamed of them. And if that was true for people in the Old Testament, the writer of Hebrews says, if that was true for people who never saw the full intent of God, never experienced or heard clearly about the valor of Jesus Christ in his incarnation and his crucifixion, then it must be doubly true for us. It is our faith in Jesus, our trust of him, that brings to us all that he has to give. Jesus says time and again, your faith has healed you. Your faith has made you well. Because it is by faith that we open ourselves to his working. It is by faith that we take into ourselves the essence of that for which we hope and prove the truth of what is unseen. There is a price, though. Seen through the eyes of faith, this price is negligible. It's a giving up nothing at all, for absolutely everything. But seen from this side of that act of will, that faith, from this side, it is a cost that must be counted. The cost of faith is that you will be, like Abram, a stranger and an exile on the earth. You will acknowledge and understand that this fallen world is not your true home. You don't really belong here. All around you there is a war raging against God, but you are on the other side. You are first and foremost a subject of the King of all kings. Only as he wills, and only to the extent that he wills, are you then a resident of the earth, a citizen of the United States, even a member of your own family. None of those is your true home, no matter how much you venerate them. Your true home is with God. So in this life, we are simply on our way home. And Jesus tells us to have our loins girded and our lamps burning. In other words, be ready to go. This is not your home, and you must be ready to quit it whenever the time comes. We mustn't be undressed with the lights out when the master returns from the marriage feast. Otherwise, we won't be ready to welcome him. We must be awake. We must be awake and ready to receive him, because he is coming and we don't know when. Jesus says, "It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." But are we prepared to make ourselves subjects of that kingdom? Have we counted the cost? Are we really ready to not fit in with the world? Are we ready to be slaves of God, as Abram made himself? Are we ready to be completely dependent on him, not entirely in charge of our own destiny? Because if we're not prepared to do that, then we will never allow God to give us true faith. But if we do, we will be served by the God who we ourselves serve. And in the end, we will finally be home. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.